Ilara stood in the center of the clearing, her body still humming with the remnants of power that had passed through her. The forest around her felt different, now not broken, not battling itself, but whole. The whispers drifted through the air in gentle waves, no longer desperate, no longer resisting the silence that wove between them like unseen roots. The first silence had not disappeared, nor had it consumed the forest. It lingered in the spaces between, threading itself into the world like a forgotten truth, waiting to be heard. The sleeper's golden gaze met hers. "You have done something no one before you dared to do," they said. "You did not banish the silence, nor did you let it consume the dream. You created something new." Ilara let out a slow breath. "It didn't feel like creation," she admitted. "It felt like remembering." The first silence stirred, its presence shifting in slow, deliberate movements. "Perhaps," he whispered, "it was always meant to be remembered." The words settled over them, soft and inevitable. The balance had changed, and the forest would never be as it was before. Ilara turned her gaze to the trees. The golden threads woven through their leaves had not vanished, but neither had they overtaken the silver mist curling along the branches. There was both light and darkness now, both the sound and stillness. The forest had not chosen one or the other. It had chosen both. A breeze stirred, carrying the scent of damp earth and blooming jasmine. The river in the distance hummed, its melody no longer the same as before. It had changed, just as everything else had. Just as she had. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter than before, though no less certain. The sleeper stepped forward, their golden glow now softer, more diffused, like the first light of dawn. "Now the forest learns to live with both its voice and its silence." The first silence rippled, its form shifting, stretching through the air like the space between heartbeats. "And you," it murmured, "must decide what you are now." Ilara blinked. "What I am." The sleeper nodded. "You are no longer just a traveler who wandered too far." The first silence pulsed. "You are the bridge between dream and stillness." A slow understanding settled in her chest. She had come to wake the whispers, but in doing so, she had woken something else, something larger, something older, something no one had thought to name. She looked at the forest again, at the way it breathed, the way it listened, the way it spoke, in ways it never had before. Ilara let the truth settle inside her, feeling it take root like the ancient trees that surrounded her. She was no longer just a traveler, no longer merely a seeker of lost whispers, was something else, something undefined, something born in the space between dream and stillness. The forest pulsed with quiet recognition, as if it too had realized what she had become. The sleepers studied her, their golden gaze holding something softer now, something almost reverent. The balance has shifted, they murmured. The forest breathes a new breath, and it will need a voice to guide it. The first silence did not move, but Alara could feel its presence wrap around her, steady and patient. And it will need a quiet place to rest, it whispered. The realization settled deeper, filling the spaces within her that had always longed for answers. The forest did not need only whispers, nor did it need only silence. It needed both, intertwined like roots and wind, like shadow and light. And she was the bridge between them. "What must I do?" she asked, the words slipping from her lips as easily as breath. The sleeper lifted a hand, their fingers trailing through the air, leaving faint golden trails in their wake. "The forest is awake, but it must learn to exist in harmony," they said. "That will not happen on its own." The first silence pulsed beside her, its form shifting, unraveling at the edges like a whisper at the end of a sentence. "There are still places where the silence is too deep, where the whispers cannot reach," it said. "And there are places where the whispers are too loud, drowning out the stillness that holds them together." Ilara nodded. She understood. The forest was awake, but it was unbalanced, uncertain of itself. It had never lived in this state before. It had always been one or the other. Now it had to learn how to be both. She turned her gaze outward, looking at the vast expanse of trees, at the river winding through the roots, at the sky stretching endlessly above. The path before her was no longer one of seeking or waking. It was one of guiding, of shaping, of teaching the forest how to exist in its new state. "I will do it," she said softly. "I will help it learn." The sleeper and the first silence did not speak, but she could feel their acknowledgement ripple through the air, settling into the branches and the roots like a new beginning. The forest whispered. The silence hummed. And Ilara stepped forward, ready to begin. Elara moved through the forest, feeling the shift beneath her feet, as if the very earth recognized her presence. The air around her was alive with something new, not just the familiar hum of whispers, nor the still weight of silence, but a delicate balance of both, woven together like strands of twilight. The trees did not simply speak, they listened. The silence did not simply linger, it embraced. But even as the harmony settled, she knew there were places where the balance had not yet reached. Places where echoes still clung to the past, where the silence remained too deep, too heavy, and the whispers had not yet found their way in. She stepped onto a path that had not been there before, one that unfurled beneath her like a ribbon of silver light. It led deeper into the forest, where the air felt thick with something unspoken, something waiting. The sleeper and the first silence did not follow, but their presence lingered at the edges of her thoughts, watching, waiting. This part of the journey was hers alone. The trees grew denser as she walked, their branches arching over her like the vaulted ceiling of an ancient temple. The light dimmed, swallowed by something unseen, till the whispers around her thinned into hushed murmurs, uncertain and distant, and then silence. Not the soft, steady kind she had come to understand. Not the silence that embraced, that rested between words. This silence was empty, hollow. She felt it press against her skin, stretching outward in all directions, swallowing every breath of wind, every rustling leaf. A place where time had stopped, where sound had been stolen and locked away. Elara's heartbeat was the only thing she could hear. She stepped forward. The silence deepened. A presence stirred. Something was here. Not the first silent shush would have recognized its quiet weight, its patient watchfulness. Elara held her breath as the silence thickened, pressing against her skin like an unseen force. The air no longer moved, the trees no longer whispered, the world here was utterly still. But something was watching. She could feel it, a presence buried deep within the quiet, waiting in the hollow spaces where sound had once lived. Her heartbeat echoed unnaturally loud in her ears. She took another step, and the moment her foot touched the earth, the silence shifted. It did not break, did not shatter, but it wavered, as if something within it had stirred for the first time in an eternity. A shadow rippled at the edge of her vision, but when she turned, nothing was there The silence thickened again. Not empty, not waiting, listening. Elara swallowed, forcing herself to steady her breath. "I know you're here," she said, her voice small against the weight of the quiet. The silence trembled. Another ripple just beyond her reach, a presence shifting, hesitant. "You don't have to hide," she whispered. The stillness deepened, stretching out, but this time it felt different, less consuming, less hollow. Then a sound so faint she almost didn't recognize it. A breath, not hers. The presence in the silence was waking. Elara stood motionless, every muscle in her body tensed as the silence around her shifted, no longer hollow, but stirring with something unseen, something waking. The breath she had heard was faint, almost imperceptible, yet it sent a ripple through the stillness, breaking the frozen quiet with the smallest tremor of life. Down, she strained to listen, to feel, to understand what was emerging from the depths of this forgotten silence. The presence was not like the first silence. It did not exist with patient stillness, nor did it hum with quiet understanding. This silence was fractured, uncertain, as if it had once been part of something greater, but had since been left behind, locked away in the depths of the forest's memory. Elara took another slow step forward, her breath steady but careful, feeling the weight of the air around her shift in response. The trees loomed taller here, their trunks smooth and black, as if untouched by time, as if they had never known the whisper of wind or the soft murmur of leaves. The world here had forgotten how to breathe, and yet something within it was trying to remember. She reached out, fingers grazing the bark of the nearest tree. It was cold, not the natural coolness of wood, but something deeper, something untouched by warmth for too long. The silence around her shuddered again, and she felt it not just as an absence, but as something alive, something lost. Then she heard it again, a breath, closer this time. She turned sharply, her eyes scanning the empty space between the trees, the shadows stretching like frozen echoes of something long forgotten. The silence did not move, did not shift, but she could feel it watching her, could sense something unseen stirring at its core. "What are you?" she asked softly. The silence trembled, as if the question itself had unsettled it. Another breath, this one slower, deliberate, and then a voice, faint, fragile, like wind slipping through the cracks of a long sealed door. "I don't remember." Ilara's breath caught. It was not an echo, not a whisper carried by the forest. It was real, near, present. A voice that had been lost to silence for so long that even it no longer knew what it was. She steadied herself. "You were something once," she said gently. "Something more than this." The silence pulsed, shifting around her like a tide pulling away from the shore. The voice hesitated. I was part of the forest." The words cracked, unsteady, as if spoken for the first time in an eternity. Ilara swallowed. "Then you are still part of it," she said. "But something took you away." A pause. Then the silence shuddered again, as if wrestling with something unseen. "I was sealed," the voice finally said, barely more than a thread of sound. "Hidden, forgotten." The weight of its words pressed into her, filling the air between them. Something had been locked away here, not just silence, not just absence, but something alive, something torn from the balance of the forest and buried in the deepest quiet. Ilara's fingers curled against the cold bark of the tree. "Who did this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The silence did not answer immediately. It wavered, pulling away, shrinking into itself, as if afraid of the truth it held. Then, slowly, the voice returned, quieter than before. "The forest," it said. Ilara frowned. "The forest." A slow, heavy pulse moved through the air, shifting the space around her. "I was once like the sleeper," the voice murmured. "But I was different. The forest did not understand me. It feared me." The air around her pressed inward. "So it locked me away." Ilara's heartbeat quickened. She had thought she understood the balance between the whispers and the silence, had believed she had seen the full truth of the forest's voice. But now she realized there was something else, something forgotten, something the forest itself had chosen to erase, and she had found it. Ilara's breath was steady, but beneath the surface of her calm, questions churned like a river breaking against stone. The presence before her was not just silence, not just absent sight, was something that had once been part of the forest, something the trees had once known, and then, for reasons unknown, had chosen to forget. The weight of that truth settled deep in her chest. "You were sealed away," she said slowly, her voice barely louder than the hush around her. why. The silence stirred again, uncertain, curling inward as though it was trying to remember a memory buried too deep. "I do not know," the voice whispered, unsteady, almost fragile. "I only know that I was once here, and then I was not." The edges of the quiet pulsed, shifting, unraveling just slightly, as though the presence itself was only now realizing its own existence. Elara took another step forward, her feet pressing into the cold earth, the trees stretching taller around her, their dark trunks watching, waiting. "Then let's remember," she said softly. The silence did not answer, but something in the air changed, a trembling shift, as if the forest itself had heard her. A memory lay buried here, and if she had found the place where it had been forgotten, then perhaps she could find the truth of what had been lost. She reached out again, this time not to touch the trees, but to touch the space itself, to feel the pulse of the quiet that surrounded her. The silence did not resist her. Instead, it opened, unraveling, and in that unraveling, something shifted. A sound, not a voice, not a whisper, but the faintest echo of something deeper, something older than even the sleeper. It was the memory of a song, but a song that had never been sung. A rhythm without melody, a breath without words. It pressed into her, filling the spaces between thought and sound, pulling at something buried inside her own mind. And then she saw it, not with her eyes, but with something deeper, something beyond sight. A vision unfolded before her, not clear, not whole, but scattered, as if the memory itself had been shattered and left to drift in the quiet. She saw the forest not as it was, not even as it had been, but as it had once existed before the first whisper, before the first dream. A world not filled with voices, nor with silence, but something in between, something that pulsed with a rhythm of its own. And at the center of that world stood a figure, neither light nor shadow, neither form nor absence, but something woven from the spaces between all things. The keeper of the unspoken. It had no eyes, no mouth, no name, and yet it had been part of the forest, moving through it as naturally as the wind through the leaves. It had not whispered, nor had it remained silent. It had simply been, and the forest had loved it until it had not. The vision wavered, flickering like a dying ember, and Elara felt the weight of what came next before she saw it. A shift in the forest's breath. Ani, the sleeper, had been born, not as a being, but but as a necessity, a dream woven into the roots of the trees, the first whisper carried on the wind. And as the whispers grew, the keeper of the unspoken became something else, something other. The forest had not understood it, had not known what to do with a presence that did not whisper, did not dream, did not fit into the world it was shaping for itself. And so, out of fear, out of confusion, it had sealed the keeper away. Not out of cruelty, not out of malice, but because the forest had believed that it had to choose. And it had chosen whispers. The vision collapsed, and Alara staggered back, breathless, the weight of the past pressing into her chest. She had found what had been forgotten. The presence before her, the silence that had been locked away, it was not just an echo of something lost. It was the keeper, and it had been waiting all this time to be remembered. She steadied herself, heart pounding, thoughts racing. "I see you now," she whispered. The silence trembled. The keeper did not speak, but it did not have to. The moment Alara had spoken those words, something shifted again, not just in the air around her, but in the very fabric of the forest itself. The trees stretched taller, the hush no longer heavy but alive, the quiet not empty but full. And then, for the first time, the keeper of the unspoken stepped forward. Alara did not move as the keeper of the unspoken stepped forward, its form shifting like mist caught between light and shadow, neither solid nor entirely absent. The air around it pulsed, not with breath, not with sound, but with something deeper, energy that existed between silence and voice, between knowing and forgetting. For the first time, she understood what she was seeing. This was not simply a forgotten part of the forest. This was the balance that had been abandoned, the presence that had been erased when the world had chosen whispers over quiet. And now, after countless ages sealed away, the keeper was standing before her, waiting. Its presence did not press against her, did not demand, did not threaten. It only existed, and in that existence, it asked the question that had long been unanswered. Will you listen? The words did not come as sound, but as understanding, slipping into her mind like water flowing into an empty space. The forest had once chosen to forget, had sealed this presence away because it had not known what to do with something that did not speak, did not sing, did not hum with the rhythm of its dreaming roots. But now the forest was different. She was different. and she had the choice to do what had never been done before. She took a slow, steady breath and nodded. I will listen. The silence around her shifted, deepened not in a way that swallowed sound, not in a way that erased, but in a way that opened. The forest held its breath, the whispers curling around the space between the trees, waiting for what came next. And then, for the first time since it had been sealed away, the keeper of the unspoken spoke. Not in words, not in sound, but in memory, in a wave of understanding that rushed through her, showing her not only what had been lost, but what had never been given the chance to exist. The forest had never needed to choose between whispers, and silence it had only believed it did. It had created the sleeper because it had been afraid of stillness. It had erased the keeper because it had feared what could not be understood. But the keeper had never been meant to be forgotten. It had been meant to be part of the balance, the steady force that lived between sound and quiet, the rhythm that gave breath to both. The knowledge poured into Alara like light breaking through an ancient canopy, filling the spaces inside her that had always been waiting for answers she had never known she needed. And as it did, she realized something else. She had not just woken the forest. She had changed it. The forest of whispers, the forest of silencing, neither could exist without the other, and neither had ever been whole on its own. But now, for the first time, the forest could be what it was always meant to be. She met the keeper's gaze, though it had no true eyes, no true form. You don't have to remain hidden anymore, she said, her voice soft but steady. The forest is ready. The keeper did not answer in words, but she felt its acknowledgement ripple through the quiet, a pulse of energy that wove through the trees, through the roots, through the golden threads that had once been frayed and uncertain. The whispers did not fade, nor did the silence retreat. Instead, they moved together, weaving into something new. A balance, not forced, not chosen out of fear, but something whole, something that belonged. And as the forest adjusted to this truth, Alara understood her place in it. She was no longer just the traveler who had wandered too far, no longer just the one who had woken the sleeper or uncovered the first silence. She was something else now, a bridge, a keeper of both voice and stillness, a guardian of the space between. The forest breathed, and for the first time in all its endless memory, it was whole. Alara stood at the heart of the forest, feeling its breath move through her like a tide that had finally reached the shore after an eternity of waiting. The keeper of the unspoken remained before her, its presence no longer bound by the weight of forgetting, no longer hidden in the hollow spaces where the world had refused to look. It was here, fully and completely, existing beside the whispers rather than beneath them. And the forest alive, awake was, learning to hold them both. The trees no longer bent in fear of silence, nor did they cling desperately to the murmurs that wove through their roots. The air was still, but not empty. The whispers flowed, but did not overwhelm. It was a rhythm, a dance, a balance that had never been allowed to exist before. And yet, Alara knew that something still lingered. A final piece of the story that had yet to be placed, a question left unanswered. She turned her gaze to the keeper, watching the way its form shifted, neither light nor shadow, neither presence nor absence, but something that existed in the space between all things. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet but certain. The keeper did not answer right away. Instead, it lifted its unseen gaze to the sky, to the endless stretch of stars woven between the treetops. And then, with a voice that carried both the weight of time and the weightlessness of a breath never taken, it spoke. "The forest must learn." The words settled into her bones, and she understood. The world had never known this balance before. It had always chosen one or the other, whispers or silence, sound or stillness, memory or forgetting. But now, for the first time, it had both, and it did not yet know what that meant. The forest would have to learn how to exist in its own new truth, to carry the weight of both voice and quiet without fear. And Sheshi was part of that learning, a bridge between what had been and what would be, a keeper of the balance that had finally come home. She turned her hands over, feeling the energy of the forest move through her fingertips, no longer sharp or uncertain, but steady, whole. "Then I will help it learn," she said. The keeper inclined its head, a motion that was neither gratitude nor command, but something softer, something that simply was. "You already are." The wind stirred, carrying with it a new sound, a song not sung with words, but with the breath of the trees, the rhythm of the shifting roots, the spaces between the echoes of all that had come before. The keeper stepped back, its its form dissolving into the fabric of the air, not disappearing, but becoming part of the world that had once cast it aside. The balance had been restored, not by force, not by sacrifice, but by understanding. And Laura, the traveler, the seeker, the one who had stepped too far into a world that had nearly forgotten itself, had become its guardian. She turned, feeling the pull of the forest, not as a path, but as a presence that moved with her now, no longer guiding her forward, but walking beside her. There were places where the balance was still fragile, where the echoes of the past still lingered in fear of what had changed. But she would go to them. She would listen. She would teach them what the forest had forgotten and what it had now remembered. And as she stepped into the trees, disappearing to the endless breath of the world, the forest whispered not in desperation, not in fear, but in something new, in harmony. Ilara moved through the forest, no longer just a traveler, but something woven into the rhythm of its breath, a presence that belonged to both the whispers and the silence. The trees no longer watched her with uncertainty. They bent gently in recognition, their leaves rustling in voices that no longer feared the hush that drifted between them. The ground beneath her feet pulsed with quiet energy, the roots shifting in slow harmony, no longer resisting the stillness, no longer drowning in sound. But she knew her journey was not over. The balance had returned, but balance was not something that could be set in place and forgotten. It had to be nurtured, protected, carried forward with each step, with each breath. There were still places where the echoes of the past clung too tightly, where the silence was too deep, where the whispers had not yet learned how to exist without consuming everything. And she would find them, not to change them, not to force them into something new, but to show them what the forest had learned, that both could exist, that neither had to be erased. She moved between the towering trunks, her fingers grazing the bark, feeling the pulse of life beneath it, a hum that vibrated not just with sound, but with presence. She walked for what felt like hours, or maybe only moments. The forest no longer measured time in the way she once had. And then she reached the first place where the balance had not yet settled. The clearing, untouched by the change that had swept through the rest of the woods, a space where the silence was still absolute, thick, unmoving. The trees here did not whisper. They stood frozen, their branches stiff, as if caught in a time before the first breath of the world. The air pressed in around her, heavy, expectant. She stepped forward, feeling the weight of the quiet settle into her bones, not as something empty, but as something waiting. And then she did what no one had done in this place for a long time. She spoke. "You are not forgotten." The silence trembled just slightly, as if unsure whether to recoil or to listen. "The forest has changed," she said, her voice steady, not forcing, not demanding, only offering. "But you do not have to be afraid of what comes next." The air did not stir, but she could feel it, a presence buried beneath the hush, something that had long since sealed itself away, something that had refused to change because it did not know how. She knelt, pressing her palm against the cold earth, feeling the energy beneath it, the slow heartbeat of the land. "You are part of this," she whispered. The silence shuddered. Then, for the first time, the wind stirred through the clearing, slow and hesitant, carrying the softest whisper of movement through the still branches. It was not a song, not yet, but it was a beginning. She closed her eyes, breathing it in, letting the quiet settle around her, no longer something separate from the whispers, but something woven into them. She would return to the places that still held fear, to the echoes that had not yet learned to let go. She would walk where the balance had not yet found its footing, and she would teach them what she had learned, that the forest did not have to choose between its past and its future. It only had to remember how to listen. Elara remained still, listening as the first delicate breath of wind moved through the once frozen clearing, carrying with it the faintest echo of something waking. The silence did not break. It did not shatter beneath the whisper of air, but it shifted, as if testing the edges of its own existence. She did not push it further, did not try to force sound into a space that had only known stillness. Instead, she let it be, let it settle, let it learn that it did not have to be afraid of what came next. She rose to her feet, her fingers brushing the nearest tree, feeling the coolness of its bark, the pulse of its roots beneath the ground. The silence here had not been defiant, it had been afraid that if it allowed the whispers in, it would disappear. But now it had taken its first breath, and that was enough. She stepped back, feeling the balance shift, not completed, not perfect, but beginning. And she knew her work was far from over. There would be other places like this, places where the change had not yet reached, where the fear of what was new still held the past in its grip, and she would go to them one by one as long as it took, because she was the bridge now, the keeper of both whispers and the stillness. And the forest was still learning how to be whole. Elara took one final breath, feeling the weight of the forest settle around her, not as a burden, but as a presence that would always move with her, guiding and learning in equal measure. The wind stirred gently, carrying both whispers and silence, neither overpowering the other, both existing as they were meant to be. She had found what had been forgotten, had woken what had been lost, and now the forest could breathe as it was always meant to. She turned, stepping back onto the path that would lead her beyond this place, beyond the clearings still trapped in their past, beyond the roots still tangled in memory. There was more to do, but she was no longer just a traveler, no longer just a seeker of lost things. She was part of the balance now, a keeper of the spaces in between, a guardian of what had once been and what was still to come. As she walked, the forest whispered her name, not in farewell, not in longing, but in something deeper, in recognition, in gratitude, in promise. And as she disappeared into the trees, the forest stood whole at last, neither bound by silence nor ruled by whispers, but carried forward by both. Enjoy the sounds of nature.